Good evening and welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Museum of the American Revolution. My name is Adrienne Whaley and I am the Director of Education and Community Engagement here in the museum. And I'm so excited to have all of you joining us here this evening. I am actually in the galleries of the Museum of the American Revolution. I am located in the gallery that tells a really interesting story, number one, about the evolution of the Constitution and the slow but steady process of the states signing on for this new and revolutionary document. But as we know, as the Constitution was being developed, lots of questions were also being debated about the rights that everyday people across the new states of this new nation and how those individuals would have rights, practice them, and be able to express them in a very dynamic and very revolutionary moment. So I want to thank a number of individuals for helping us to put on the wonderful program that you all are about to experience this evening. So I want to say that we are so grateful to the exhibit sponsors for When Women Lost the Vote, which is the rest of the story that's being told in this space that I'm in. So on one side, I've got the Constitution, but behind me, I actually have, for example, a poll list from Montgomery Township, New Jersey in 1801 that remarkably shows the names not only of the individuals that we might associate with voting rights in the Revolutionary era, but also women and also people of African descent, and specifically a number of Black men. It's a wonderful document to have behind me as we begin to engage in a conversation about Black voters in revolutionary America and about how you research the stories of Black individuals in general and sort of what their stories can tell us about rights, about wrongs, about revolution. So I want to thank our exhibit sponsors, Bank of America and Comcast NBC Universal, presenting sponsors of When Women Lost the Vote. I want to also acknowledge that other support was provided by the Pennsylvania Department of Community and Economic Development and the National Society Daughters of the American Revolution. The exhibition was also made possible in part by a major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, Exploring the Human Endeavor. We're also so grateful to our members and donors whose support fuels the research, the partnerships, and the collaboration that you will hear about this evening. So I just want to thank all of them in advance. So the museum has so many robust virtual programs that we've been offering since COVID unfortunately had so many organizations close our doors. If you've been onto the events page on our website, you can see any number of wonderful book discussions, conversations like we're having, History Explorers Club programs for our families and our children, and lots of wonderful group programs for adult audiences, libraries, clubs, all sorts of things like that, as well as thousands and thousands of students. But the museum is also now open to the public again, currently from Friday through Sunday from 10 until 5. We are doing everything we can to make sure that this is a safe, healthy, and comfortable experience for everybody. You'll see folks walking around in masks when we're open to the public. We are making sure that we have enough space in the galleries for our guests to move around freely without crowding. We are doing all of the things that we can in order to make sure that you are comfortable and feel welcome and safe in this environment. So joining us this evening, we've got four wonderful individuals who are going to help us understand some of what it is that you see around me and also on your screen right now for this exhibit, When Women Lost the Vote. So this is a revolutionary story looking from 1776 to 1807 at a dynamic moment in time in New Jersey when if they had a certain amount of property, women and free people of African descent actually had the ability to vote. Now, this exhibit exists not only in our galleries, but also as of very recently online as an evergreen resource that you can always go back to find more information. So if you hear something that sparks your interest and we don't dig too deeply into it this evening, then please visit our website, amrevmuseum.org, and go to exhibits to learn more about the full story of When Women Lost the Vote. But I'd like right now to just let you know about the wonderful folks that we have with us this evening. So first we've got Dr. Philip Mead, who is our chief historian and curator and was one of the co-curators for this exhibit. We're also joined by Dr. Marcela Micucci, who was our curatorial fellow for several years as she engaged in a lot of really deep research to pull together the stories that you're going to hear a little bit more about this evening. So she was our curatorial fellow as well as co-curator of this exhibit. Then we also have two amazing women. We're joined by Elaine Buck and Beverly Mills, who are the co-founders of the Stoutsburg Sourland African American Museum, as well as the co-authors of an amazing book that everybody should read called If These Stones Could Talk, which is a wonderful exploration of African American history and stories and oral history and so much more in the Sourland Mountain region of central New Jersey. There is a lot to talk about in the course of sort of understanding these stories about Black voters, about what it was like to be alive in the time of when women lost the vote, and these fascinating individuals having this ability to vote and then seeing it go away. I'm going to ask a bunch of questions. There are hours worth of stories, but we're going to confine this to just 1 hour. But we're going to do our best to cover as much as we can. So I'm actually going to go ahead and dig in to the question and answer session or section of this experience. And so I'd like to turn it over first to Phil and Marcela. I would love for you to tell us, how did you all first encounter Beverly and Elaine? What's the story there?
Thank you so much, Adrienne, and welcome everyone. I'm so excited to have this conversation with all of you. We've been actually waiting to bring this conversation to the public since the first conversation I had with Elaine and Beverly. And I think tonight will be a little bit like that first conversation was for me, which was just fireworks of fascinating information that I'd hardly scratched the surface of in any studies I had done on our project, but became so rich and such an important part of understanding this little known story of voting in early New Jersey, which is really a crucial story for understanding the origins of the American idea of voting. Now, the conversation with Elaine and Beverly and Marcela and I began about 10 months ago, when Marcela and I had been researching the story of when women lost the vote, the story of 30 years in New Jersey history when women were constitutionally allowed to vote as long as they were possessed of 50 pounds of proclamation money, but that in fact, the vote was even more open than that because of ambiguities in the law about how to evaluate that wealth. And then that vote was stripped away from women in 1807 on the grounds that their votes were leading, among other things, to a lot of voting irregularities and corruption. The 1776 to 1807 period, though, was also a period when people of color were allowed to vote in New Jersey, and their votes were also stripped away in 1807. Marcela's digging produced this poll list out of the New Jersey State Archives. This is actually a document that recorded the names of all the people who came to actually vote and were accepted as voters. It had 163 women's names on it. That was the first time that any historians had been able to prove that large numbers of women voted. But it was really only later in the process that we started to pay real attention to the voters of color. And what prompted it at first was one voter's name, which you can see in the center of this, the center panel of this slide, Ephraim Hagerman, and above his name was written Negro. Now, this is also from the 1801 Montgomery Township poll list in Somerset County. And you can see these other highlighted names are also of people who we're quite certain are of African descent. Harry Van Pelt, Caesar Trent, Ephraim Hagerman, Thomas Blue, and then this name at the top on the right here is either Isaac or Jude Blue. We can get into that debate more. But once we had this name, we realized we've got to dig into these names and find out how many voters of color we have, and then find out their stories, just as we've been doing with these women voters. And a professor at Penn State Abington, Shan Holt, who had been on our scholarly committee, strongly encouraged me to reach out to Elaine and Beverly. And I called them up to ask them about Hagerman and others. And we talked for over 2 hours one afternoon with so many interesting questions coming out of that. I quickly got their book, and it's a spectacular read. And I think it really pushed our exhibit to a whole new level and the conversation about voting to a whole new level. We subsequently went out to visit them in the so-called Sourland region, and discovered that these voters of color we found in our poll list were part of a community that Elaine and Beverly were documenting both in their published works and in their project to found a new African American museum out in Stoutsburg, Sourland. This community was one of many that formed in early America as a home for people of color, often in lands that were less desirable and were not sought after by propertied white people. These are some images of the Sourland area. It's very rocky, very mountainy. It's very wooded and very, very dark. Elaine and Beverly tell me at night. They say even, I think you said even the fire people won't go up there easily, and because of how difficult it is as terrain at night. So as we started digging into this story, it was a fascinating story of not just individual African-American voters, but of a whole community of people who were forging their lives, their properties, their freedom out of this part of the middle of New Jersey, not too far from Princeton College, University, as you can see on this map, and also closely tied into a lot of other townships in the area. So we went out there to Sourland, and you can see it mapped out. You can see the extent to which it crosses several townships on these maps, and met with Elaine and Beverly, and we were able, through their generous time and guidance, to record a video for our website and for you all, exploring both the cemetery where many of these African Americans are buried, and also the Mount Zion AME Church that was founded in that community, and which you can see here. With that, I'd like to go to that video, and you can get a sense, I think, of the extraordinary information and experiences and memory out there.
Today we're in Hopewell Township, New Jersey at the Stoutsburg Cemetery, founded in the mid to early 19th century, exploring some of America's first African-American free voters on the Montgomery Township poll list from 1801.
Henry Lane, Moses Blue, and Stacy Stives. Those three men were able to purchase this cemetery, the land that we're standing on right now, from the Stout family. And the purpose of that was to be able to have a burial ground for African Americans, because prior to that time, African Americans and whites could not be buried together. So they wanted to have a place of dignity and honor for African Americans to be buried. So those three men were trailblazers.
One of the three African-American voters identified on the 1801 Montgomery poll list was Ephraim Hagerman. Ephraim Hagerman is the only African-American that is actually listed as Black on the 1801 Montgomery Township list. He lived in this community in Sourland, Stoutsburg, and in Montgomery Township, and it's very likely that he was one of the hundreds of unmarked graves here at the Stoutsburg Cemetery that commemorated free African-Americans.
My grandmother would always tell us that we were related to the Hagermans. There's several families here that are buried that we are related to, and the Hagermans being one of them. I would say with much certainty that Ephraim Hagerman is buried here because a lot of his relatives are here. other people that he would have been familiar with that lived on the mountain, neighbors, family members, church parishioners. I would say that he is among one of these unmarked graves right here resting on the mountain. To think that people of color were able to vote at that time before they were disenfranchised in 1801, it is mind-boggling, to say the least. It's an amazing story. It seems like there's stories within stories in the cemetery.
I feel like that video is just scratching the surface and there's so much more to dig into. So maybe this is our opportunity to now turn to Beverly and Elaine. Number one, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and thank you for all of the assistance and the context that you provided as we started digging into these stories for the exhibit. I wonder if you all could take us on a little bit of a journey and just help us to understand some of the history of people of African descent in the Stoutsburg, Sourland region.
Thank you for having us this evening. I wish that I could really answer that question about all the stories when I mentioned stories within stories, because we have people that lived in the region that were descendants of slaves. We have people that served in all theaters of war. We have people that just contributed so richly to the region. And as we continue to unearth those stories, we're just finding that they made such a major contribution to this whole area. And this little church that you're seeing here, how important that was to the whole socialization and this spiritual life of the people on the mountain. And that was just one part of it. So I'll let Elaine talk too about what the mountain means to her and some of the ancestors that we know about.
Well, when I look at the cemetery and at this at the Mount Zion AME Church, and I think back to how the enslaved people were actually brought to our community, we start back with the slave ships and how the slave ships brought these people right to Philadelphia, right to New York. And from there, they were brought out to our communities by some of the Dutch settlers. So we've been here since the beginning of the 13 colonies. And we have a rich history in the Sourland Mountain and in the Stoutsburg community. The church itself was a sister church to Mother Bethel, which was started by an enslaved individual, Richard Allen. Richard Allen starts the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia. And then he comes to New Jersey, and he's in Pennington, which is 2 towns over from where this museum is at. He comes there, and after he stays in the area for 6 months, then after he spreads the word and preaches and lives among the people, these churches started to pop up. And so, now there's millions of AME parishioners, but we have them right here in our community. And that's what we're proud of. You'll see that this Stoutsburg Cemetery has the names of the True family, the Hagerman family, the Blue family. All of these are people that started and settled our communities.
And I also wanted to add, just very quickly, that the names of these African-American families mirror those of the white founding families of the region.
Mm-hmm. And so you all know some really interesting stories about the connections between those families, right? And then I also know that you've got at least one Revolutionary War veteran that is tied into this whole story. So tell us a little bit about both of those.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, William Stives, he was actually, he got the whole thing going for us, because when we started this whole journey, which is now, when we look back, it's like 15 years, we can't believe it, 15, 16 years. And it started because we wanted to stop the desecration of a cemetery about 10 miles away, and we got a phone call and said, there's something going on. We need your advice. Anyway, from that, we started to wonder, we're the stewards of a cemetery that we never once gave any thought about who may be buried there. So we started to look in records, and Elaine's Aunt Virginia, who was one of the secretaries of the Stoutsburg Cemetery Association, kept notes, and she kept a record about William Stives. And we thought, well, this was very interesting. And it turns out that she was a descendant of this William Stives. Little did we know that this man turned out to be a veteran of the Revolutionary War. He was the first Black inhabitant to settle in the Sourland Mountains, and he raised 10 children there. And he was an extraordinary man. He stayed in the area and was a member of the Old School Baptist Church for 40 years. The mystery is that we don't know for sure if he's actually buried in the Stoutsburg Cemetery. We want to think he is because he has other family members there. But as a member of the Old School Baptist Church, there is a possibility he could be buried there, albeit away from the white parishioners, which is heartbreaking as a Revolutionary War veteran.
Yeah, and I think that just brings to light some of the contradictions and the challenges of, ideals in the Revolutionary era. How do we live out what it means to believe that all men are created equal? And what does that mean when men of different colors, different backgrounds are all fighting alongside one another for the independence of this country? How does that then get worked out, what their race should or should not mean about their access to rights?
Right. And considering that he also received the Badge of Merit from George Washington, and his discharge papers were signed personally by George Washington, which we have a copy of. So yeah, it is. You're absolutely right.
That's amazing. And then one of the headstones that you all showed, we saw it on the screen, it had the name True, and that reminded me that you all have an amazing story of an individual named Friday Trueheart. So please tell us about that.
Well, Friday Trueheart is my fourth great grandfather, and he was brought to the area by the Reverend Oliver Hart, who came to pastor the Old School Baptist Church that I just mentioned back in 1780. He came from Charleston, South Carolina, a very, very staunch patriot, and pretty much was going to get into trouble by the time the British came to invade Charleston. So he had to get out of Dodge, and he came north, and he came to pastor the Old School Baptist Church. And when he left Charleston, he brought with him a 13-year-old boy by the name of Friday, who turned out to be my fourth great grandfather. Friday was finally manumitted through Oliver Hart's will. And he was not freed immediately. He had 7 additional years to stay under the care of Hart's wife. So it was one of those complicated situations. Friday was by that time a man that was married, and he had his own children. And so he was a free man, but albeit, at that time, in his 30s when he finally got his freedom. So that's my fourth great grandfather.
That's amazing. I'm so jealous of you, just as a genealogist, the level of detail that you have in this story. I want to be you one day. So I'm wondering maybe if you and Elaine can tell us a little bit, based on all of the research that you all have done into people of African descent in the Revolutionary era and onward in that region, thinking about some of the men that we know are on this poll list here, people like Ephraim Hagerman and Thomas Blue and so on and so forth. What would it have been like for them to show up at the polls? Like, what do you think that moment was like for them when their name ends up on this list?
Oh, gosh. Well, we've talked about this. Elaine and I, we visualized this. Elaine, what do you think it was like for them to stand there with the Mershons and the Stocktons and the Duriers and people that were slave owners at one point?
Yeah, I was thinking about all the people that lived in this community, African Americans that lived in this community as enslaved individuals. And for them to show up at the polls in 1801 and vote, I mean, first off, they must have been really, really proud. And they
Absolutely.
had to they had to have land. So here these people, how they even got the land is just like, I don't understand how they did it, because keep in mind that New Jersey was brutal. I mean, they had their 1713. You see that they had the black codes. These black codes were designated so that they could keep people oppressed. And here these people survived all of this hard scrabble living that they had to live in these communities. And I can't tell you how proud I am to see the names of those people on the poll list. Today we did some further research on Henry Lane, who bought the Stoutsburg Cemetery. Henry Lane, Stacy Stives, and Moses
This
Blue.
blue, yes.
We think about them now. The Blue family was enslaved by the White Blue family, which goes on to be the founders of Blauenberg, which is right in Montgomery. And we think about just what did they have to go to even to get to the polls. I mean, really.
You know, they had to be engaged. When I think about them, I think, you know, they knew enough of what they wanted for their lives and how they wanted to be citizens, and they wanted to be fully enfranchised. So you may think that in your mind, but to actually act upon it, to me, that's just remarkable. That takes a lot. It takes a lot.
That's amazing. And that makes me think of research that Marcela has done. One of the things that we've noticed on these poll lists is that oftentimes you see women's names listed in clusters on there. Marcela, tell us a little bit more about that.
Adrienne, that's a really great point. And Bethany, Elaine, while you were speaking, I was kind of going back to that place in my mind as well, because one of the really kind of telling trends that we've discovered, at least for the women voters on this list, and I'll be very interested as we continue to research it if we see similar trends for the voters of African descent, is that oftentimes these women are coming to the polling places and they're voting together in groups. For instance, as you can see on the slide that you have in front of you here, we have the Montgomery list on the left side of the screen here from 1801. We also, on the right-hand side, have a list from Upper Pensneck Township in Salem County. And on both of these lists, you can see that women aren't just coming to the polls, you know, in one or two, and sometimes they are, they're going by themselves, but oftentimes we see them voting with female family members and friends, as well as male family members. And it's been really quite an interesting research process for us to get to know who these women were that they were voting next to. And in some instances on the Montgomery list, for instance, we see some of these women that are voting with women who they actually go to church with and are listed on church records with, and in the same list of names. So it's really evidence that they were going to the polls together. And we have to, really ask the question of why might women and also, free people of color have been going to the polls to vote together. And one of the possible reasons for this could have been that, they were using a kind of buddy system or a strength in numbers, going to maybe combat any sort of criticism or prejudice that they might face when they arrived at the polling place. And I think that experience was very similar for women as much as it was for people of color. And Phil, I know that a lot of this we've done, is really just looking at the kind of environment of voting in general. If you wanted to speak a little bit more to that.
Yeah, we actually, when we were trying to imagine this and imagine what voting meant, a part of it is physical. So Marcela, you were actually able to work with local historians and identify this as this building, which is a private home now, as the Rocky Hill Inn of the early 19th century. where this actual polling list was compiled and where this vote took place in Montgomery Township in Somerset County. This is the room where it happened. Ephraim Hagerman voted here. Caesar Trent voted here. The Van Dyke women, Rebecca Van Dyke, Catherine Van Dyke, they voted here. Now the room, you can see the exterior of the building that's an L off of a building that faces the street, two streets on two different sides. We're not exactly sure how the L was open or closed to the main building at the time. And so our thought about this being the voting place is tied to some local historians' assessments of the age of this part of the building, dating back to that period. Also, there's a convenient fireplace in there, but for keeping warm, we checked on the temperatures that day. It was a mid-October day, but it was cold. It was in the 50s when they were voting, which is why in our tableau depiction of the scene, we have them wearing some gloves, carrying cloaks, and being a little bit more comfortably dressed for a warm day, but having gone into a fireplace room that's a little crowded probably, and having to take a little bit of that off. The fact that it was in a fairly tight space, means something for those people voting in groups, for the dynamics of formerly enslaved people now casting votes alongside some of the most dignified families of the town, the most propertied people in the town. And it really suggests, I think, a sense of a complicated dynamic of that community. One of the things that we came to a tentative conclusion about is that the property requirement wasn't really in effect by 1801. So you needed to have some property, but there's almost no way for the townships to arrive at whether you own 50 pounds. And Ephraim Hagerman does not own anything like that amount of property. And so whether you could vote ended up becoming basically whether the town accepted you as a respectable member of the community. And so that list looks a little different, and it reveals something of a kind of belonging shared among these groups, those separated by still very virulent ideas of racist ideas prevalent in parts of the community as well.
It's really powerful to think about what that experience would have been like for these folks, and just the questions that they might have had swirling in their heads, and the physical experience of, am I welcome? Am I safe? Can I do this? What happens if I do this? It's a lot to think about. As you all were talking, I was also thinking about how cool it is that you're able to visit this space where that people cast votes, and how fascinating it is that you're able to find something like what the weather was like on the day that they cast their votes. And then I'm thinking about the challenge that Beverly and Elaine have experienced in terms of just finding out where a person was buried, and just the juxtaposition of challenge and opportunity of this research. I'm wondering, Beverly and Elaine, if you all can talk about what are some of the challenges that you face as you tried to uncover these stories of people of African descent in New Jersey? And then what are some of the ways that you found to overcome those challenges?
Gosh, where do you start? I think that in my family, for the fact that I have enslaved people coming from New Jersey, right here in Hopewell Township. For instance, Frost Blackwell was enslaved in Hopewell Township by a very prominent family, by Andrew Blackwell, who was a veteran of the Revolutionary War. And he was a man of considerable wealth. He never married, but when he passed away, he left a considerable amount of money to nieces and nephews and his surviving siblings. So Andrew Blackwell also left in his will $100 and the freedom to his servant man Frost. So I was able to unearth that will. So I was able to find that, okay, he was manumitted through this will in 1818 upon the death of Andrew Blackwell. And then from that point, I was able to kind of piece together the story of how he was also a person who was married by the time that he was freed with his own family. And then further along, find out that he had to manumit his own wife because she was enslaved on another plantation. And I don't know whether he used that $100 and had to add to it. I don't know. What we do know is that it took him an additional 9 years to free his wife and then have her under his ownership along with their young son. So, I mean, it's very difficult because in most cases, you only have a single name. You have a name without a last name. So you have to look in the family of the enslaver. That's where you have to start. So you have to look at wills, you have to look at tax records, you have to look at manumission documents, and anything that you can kind of hone into to give you a clue. That's where you start. And you have to have a lot of patience, and it takes a while because our records were not kept. We were not issued birth certificates. You know, we might have been written down in maybe in a Bible or maybe in some kind of inventory sheet. That's where you have to look. And those were the challenges.
We looked in church records, especially the old school Baptist church is one of the oldest Baptist churches in America. We looked in their church records and found a list of Black people that were baptized and members of that church. The Van Harlingen Church, which is right in Montgomery. We looked in all of these churches. We went to the Nishannick Church. And we looked to see if we could glean some of the names of the people that we know, the descendants of that are still living in our communities. And so we did all of that. We went to the New Jersey archives. We went to all the historical societies that we could, local historical societies, to find out what we could find out about the African Americans. And when we started digging and found out that we were related to the people that we were unearthing, it was mind-blowing for us.
It was.
Yeah, I mean, it must be a particularly challenging thing to sort of understand and have to follow through in your research, the fact that for so many people of African descent in the colonies in the early nation, their presence is oftentimes recorded through their status as property. Yes. Right, as opposed to being individual beings in their own right.
Yes.
So that's a very particular challenge for people of African descent with enslaved ancestors. But I know that there are also some pretty sticky challenges to find women in the records, and oftentimes poor people, generally speaking, in the records. And I know Phil and Marcela that you all have encountered that to some extent as you do this research.
We have, Adrienne. That's a really great point. And again, Bev and Elaine, as you were speaking, I, was almost reminiscent of the experience that we had as we first started trying to, kind of rescue these women's names and free people of color from the margins of these poll lists. And, they are, like you said, Bev, they're just names on paper. Yes. And it really becomes our responsibility to do the digging to find out who they are. And it's really difficult, a similar situation, but equally challenging to find women in the historical record, because very similarly, women often in this time are their, father's daughters and then their husband's wives. Their names change when they marry. When a woman does marry, she's placed under femme coverture under English common law, which basically means a woman covered. All of her legal, political, economic rights are subsumed by her husband. Women, as a result of this, once they marry, becomes particularly relevant in New Jersey, because when they marry, they're no longer considered legal property owners because their husband owns all of their property. So it becomes questionable whether women who marry are even eligible to vote and meet the property requirement in the state of New Jersey. But what's even more difficult is that so many of these women, you know, they're named after their mothers. For instance, on the Montgomery Township list, we have a group of women with the last name Van Dyke. And through a lot of digging, we discovered that there is a Van Dyke family that's living in Montgomery Township in this period. But we were able to identify a mother, Rebecca Van Dyke, and also a daughter, Rebecca Van Dyke. The mother, Rebecca, was married. And this is when, you know, we really continue to do this digging, because it might just be assumed that if she's married that she wasn't voting. But actually looking at other records, many of which you mentioned, things like tax records, we were able to go in and see that Rebecca Van Dyke is actually listed on some of those records as paying taxes on property, which she may have called her own. And as a result of that, we can't actually be sure if the Rebecca Van Dyke on that poll list is the mother or if it's the daughter. And these are some of the many challenges that we face as we begin to explore, you know, who these people were that were voting, and how they were able to, for instance, meet the property requirement to be able to vote.
It's interesting, because the property requirement of New Jersey was so poorly written, it was so difficult for anyone to figure out who was able to vote. The property requirements in the colonies and in some of the states remained based on land, and land was fairly easy to establish who owned the land and how much it was worth. But once you depart from that, as the New Jersey Constitution of 1776 did, and just say it's people who own any amount, any kind of property equivalent to an arbitrary amount, how do you determine that? You have to know everything about someone's net worth. And this is a society with virtually none of the administrative apparatus that we now have for assessing those things. And even now, we would probably have a difficult time creating a property requirement that was enforceable in the United States. So increasingly, those who want to criticize the New Jersey Constitution of 1776 as too democratic begin to focus on categories that are physical, that tie into property rights. So womanhood, because of coverture and because once women are married, they are essentially removed from any ability to own property, and color, because of slavery and because enslaved people can't own property, become categories that the propagandists in the partisan press can seize on to try to make the case that the New Jersey Constitution is creating chaos, that there's lots of fraudulent voting. And so the solution that the New Jersey State Constitution, the New Jersey Assembly comes up with, reflects this vein of the argument, of the propaganda. And it removes the vote from women and people of color while expanding the vote to all male taxpayers. So effectively making legal the violations of law that men who didn't have property, white men, had been practicing for decades, and making explicitly illegal the votes of women and people of color, some of whom had been voting legally, some of whom had been voting, I think, like Ephraim Hagerman, despite the fact that they didn't literally meet the property requirement. And so it's a fascinating case in the emergence of the dynamics around the debate about democracy and voting in America, because when the administrative apparatus is not there to ensure equal rights, there is a removal of the votes of women and people of color, because those are physical categories that people can seize on, and that become easy scapegoats for what's a larger structural challenge.
I feel like one of the amazing things about this exhibit is that it's sort of taken, on the one hand, a recognition of the challenges that people can face in doing this kind of research. And on the other hand, like the wealth of knowledge and the background and the ability of the museum to compile with its resources, huge banks of information, or even just to dig very specifically into a particular story. And you all have actually combined them to help relieve, at least in one situation, some of the stresses and the challenges of finding this research. We've got this amazing interactive poll list that's up on our website. I wonder if one of you wants to just say a little bit, just a very little bit about that.
I can speak to that quickly. So at the museum, of course, we have the physical poll list on display in the galleries, but of course, given in the life and times that we are currently in, we wanted to make sure that we could also put those online and make them free and accessible to the public. And that's something that we did with our poll list interactive that you can access from our website at amrevmuseum.org. And what's the great part about this is that you can, not only look at the poll list, but you can go in and sift through each of the pages. You can see the names for yourself. You can highlight some of them if we have any additional information that we've been able to uncover about the voters of African descent, and also the women voters, to be able to learn more about them and their lives and their experiences. And I think it's a really great opportunity, not just as a learning tool and a very important resource, but also one in which is constantly growing and has the ability to expand, and one that we will continue to update as we uncover new research ourselves, and are also open to any new research that might be proposed to us. And it's been, I think, a really great collaborative effort, especially with Beverly and Elaine, to be able to capitalize off of your resources and your wealth of knowledge too, when it comes to this, to really be able to have a really fantastic tool that will, live on forever.
So that means that Bev and Elaine, we're looking to you, as well as everybody else who's listening, to figure out some more of those names that we have on the list, and send us your research dossier so that we can upload that information to our website. We're just going to crowdsource this and turn it into something amazing.
We'd love to. We'd love nothing more than to be able to do that.
Let me ask you all this, and I've been told that I have permission to go a couple of minutes over 7. So I'm going to ask a couple more questions. So my first question, Elaine and Beverly, if you have one piece of information, maybe about one of the revolutionary individuals that you talked about in your awesome book, If These Stones Could Talk, or somebody else from the Sourland region, what would the thing be that you want to know?
Well, for me, that's a hard question, because there's several things I want to know. But there's a David Hagerman. Notice that his name is the same as Ephraim Hagerman, and he owns 44 acres of property. And it was on the map, and it's butted up against the Lindbergh property. So 44 acres, and then we are still researching, trying to figure out how he now he doesn't have the 44 acres. He lost them. We're researching that right now so we can find that information out. But these name connections are not just coincidental. They really aren't. I mean, there's white Hagermans in the region, and there's black Hagermans. And really, when we did our research, we found out we have to research the white families, go and look in their wills and see who did they own. I looked on the poll list, and at the very bottom of one of the pages was Minnicus Dubois. Well, he was the slave owner to the 120-year-old woman that lived in the Sourland Mountain, Sylvia Dubois. And so when I see those names and I think back, oh my goodness, this is something that we need to just keep researching and keep finding out the answers to some of these questions. But that would be mine, the 44 acres. I want to know what happened to that.
I'm writing that down. Elaine, we are crowdsourcing as we speak. That's going in the poll list interactive this week.
Love it.
The land, I know, Elaine, thank you for talking about that, because the there was other Black-owned land in the Sourlands that was lost, unfortunately. But for myself, I would have to say it's rather personal. I would love to know more about Friday Trueheart and his whole being in the Sourland region, living the rest of his life there, most likely never seeing his mother again. I would love to know what happened to his mother. Mm. And I would also like to know a little bit more about Friday's life in his relationship to Oliver Hart.
Yeah, and that's a really powerful story. It's one where we actually explored a little bit in earlier this week, our Read the Revolution email that went out, and we specifically focused on the story of Friday Trueheart. So if people want to dig into that further, know that you can pick up a copy of this book, If These Stones Could Talk, and you can dig into that a little bit further. So speaking of stones and speaking of the land, which is something we keep coming back to and something that every time we say Sourland, we're really thinking about the ground on which these people walked. I'm curious, Elaine and Beverly, you all are stewards of a cemetery. And I'm wondering if you could tell us just a little bit about what you think the ongoing value is of preserving those spaces. What do you want people's relationships to be with cemeteries? It seems like a weird question. And yet, as people who love history, I think we can probably imagine some things from that.
Well, Beverly and I often talk about how we got to be stewards of the cemetery, and it was from the old folks. They had a meeting and they told us to come to the meeting, and they looked at us and said, Beverly, you're going to be the secretary. And then one day the same thing happened to me. Elaine, Beverly needs help. You're going to be the assistant. And my husband, John, now is the president. We have to pass on our heritage to our children and to our families, especially when you have these type of cemeteries like we have. I mean, this cemetery, we don't know how old it is. We think it's over 200 years old, but there's people buried in the old section from oral history. Well, we don't know who they are. We are researching, looking in the burial records from the Blackwell Memorial Funeral Home and some of the local funeral homes to see how far back we can go. And we really have to preserve these lands, keep them, don't let them get overgrown where people don't even know there's burial stones there. We have to preserve this land and keep the history going.
You know, I wanted to also mention that before Earl Nevius passed away, and he was he was a caretaker of the cemetery, dedicated member for many years, took over from his father, also Elaine and John's uncle. So before he passed away, he gave me a ledger. I never knew he had it. It was one of the early ledgers that with the cemetery members, when they decided to keep records of their meetings. So they started in like 1900, maybe 1899. But what struck me and why he decided to gift it to me was that my great grandfather was the secretary, and my great grandfather was the first African American graduate from Rider University. Mm-hmm. And it was his impeccable handwriting of these notes talking about who was at the meeting, how they opened the meeting with what hymn they sang, how much they collected in dues, different burials. And so I look at this, and it's just I can't even describe what it's like to read these entries that he's placed in there.
That's amazing. And again, I am just so jealous of you because of the power of being able to really be close to those things. And Phil, you had made an excellent point the last time that we had a conversation around this topic about the value of Black cemeteries in particular for helping us to lift up stories of people of African descent. Tell us a little bit more about what you were thinking.
Well, you know, when we were searching around for artifacts to show that were identifiable to these individuals, you know, that's a almost impossible task. If objects survive, they almost would never have their names inscribed on them. There may be a few documents surviving, though that's rare as well. But in terms of three-dimensional objects, the business of museums, part of the challenge of telling these stories is that the visual and physical features of these people's lives are gone, at least, or are not identifiable to them in many cases. And in many cases, the only thing we have left that we know of is a headstone. And so that's why we went to these graveyards, and this was the case as well. The women that we were tracing, it was very difficult to find an object we could identify with these voters, and marked their graves. You can see these wreaths we created with he voted and she voted and the dates of the votes and their names. And actually, while we're talking about crowdsourcing, one of the things that we did to build that into the exhibit were these videos, where you saw the one about Ephraim Hagerman. We've got several others on the website. I would love it if, these poll lists became a resource to mark the graves of early voters around the state. And particularly these voters who take such an exceptional step toward a more equal republic and democracy by voting by women voting and people of color voting.
Mm-hmm. So let's go from there to my final question. I'm going to use my grace period here. I'm wondering, for all of you, maybe answer in just a couple of sentences, how has this project inspired you to ask new questions? Or how has it inspired you or impacted you, your work, your approach to history or public history?
I'll start. It has motivated me to just continue and to push on, because there's days that I just feel like I'm totally depleted because of how difficult it is to unearth some of this information. But when we get a little, I call it a hit on something, it just propels us, because Elaine and I, we've been doing this work for a while, and we're getting older every day, but we're hanging in there for the long haul.
Yes. And for me, it just makes me want to keep finding out the information, but also to put the information in our Stoutsburg Sourland African American Museum. We're ready. We are ready. We need our education and exhibit center.
Oh, yes.
We were told if we have $4 million, we could have our exhibit center built and ready in 2 years. Well, otherwise, it might take 5 years. It might take longer. Well, I don't know if I have 5 good years left. I hope I do, but this information is so vital. Today, Beverly and I were we were exhausted from Black History Month, but then we found something, and Beverly said to me, she said, I'm recharged. We found a list, a census list, and it had all the colored people listed from Montgomery, all in one list.
I got one page, like colored.
27 people. And when we looked on that list, we thought, oh, we found something else that will make us really keep wanting to keep doing what we're doing. And we get excited when we find something, but we're also more excited to share it.
We are. Absolutely.
Love that. I love that so much. Marcela.
Elaine, I think you just made such a good point. I mean, it definitely does light the fire. And especially when you find, that's how the discovery of the poll list was for us. We had almost kind of, run out of hope, and we knew that, time, was ticking, and we needed to really find that needle in the haystack. And the day that we did that was a very exciting day, to say the least. But I have to say, just visiting the grave sites, going to the cemetery, and having the experience to meet you and work with you, it was it was just really fantastic. I remember as soon as we, were walking up the walkway, Beverly ran over to me with a photocopy of the Montgomery list, and she said, "We found another one." And it was like another one of those, hits that we had found, and, yet another one that we were like, "Oh, I wonder if he's here." And now we have, another, some more breadcrumbs to kind of follow to get there. And I think that those moments are really what make what we do worth it. And I think being able to use, grave sites as kind of artifacts and historical objects to be able to really recreate these lives and experiences of people who so many people have never heard of, or have just been names on paper that we can now really kind of tell their story. And I think that's not only the purpose of your book and all of our research, but really what we strive to do as historians. So it's a really fulfilling experience.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Last but not least, Bill.
Well, for me, it's just really reinvigorated my feeling and fascination with the Revolutionary period as a period where of pioneering civil rights effort. We tend to think of that as something that emerges in the mid-19th century, kind of reaches a sort of apex achievement in the 1960s, 70s. But finding these early voters raises all kinds of new questions about what the vote meant. For example, it shows that people really cared about it. They wanted to vote. I mean, they had to go into an uncomfortable room with people that they might have had very serious disagreements with, to the point of actually feeling oppressed by, and vote. And they had to walk there from, across town, across from the Sourland Mountains, maybe. There were women voting, asserting their right to vote, when that was not only not widely practiced in the United States by any stretch, but it was hugely controversial in the partisan press of the time. So those women had to know that they were subject to exceptional scrutiny. And there were people without property who, in defiance of what the Federalists in most cases were arguing was the intent of the Constitution of New Jersey and the federal Constitution to essentially empower the propertied, we're saying, you know what? I count too, and I'm gonna try to vote. And that just shows that I think historians haven't paid enough attention to the Revolution as an innovative and pioneering period for voting rights, for civil rights, for proto-feminism, you might say, for the activism of Black people, and the work of the disempowered by property. I think it's just it shows us that the Revolution was really a very radical potential thing, and we really need to keep working on it.
Yes.
What a note to end on. I mean, I think what you're highlighting is just how important this is, and how relevant this story continues to be, for better or for worse, in the contemporary era, right? Thinking about all of the ways in which we still need to be paying attention to who has access to the ability to vote in this nation. There's so many echoes that we're hearing. So it's an amazing story to have had the opportunity to dig into. I want to thank all four of you for joining us and participating in this conversation. I want to thank everybody that is joining us from afar, whether you were in your home in Philadelphia or someplace all the way across the country. I want everybody to know, number one, that this exhibit is available forever on our website. It is evergreen. Come and check it out whenever you want at amrevmuseum.org. I'm sure it's going to keep you awake tonight. So at 2 a.m., go on the website. But also know, again, that you can come and you can actually see some of these amazing artifacts and documents, like the objects that are right here behind me in the galleries. The museum is open from Friday through Sunday. So come and visit us between 10 and 5 on any of those days. If you are really interested in particular in the stories of people of African descent, I really encourage you to check out a new online interactive that's actually pulled right out of our galleries called Finding Freedom. We've actually taken all of the content from what's in the museum, we've put it online, and we've enriched it with all sorts of resources for educators, for students, for any digital explorers. So definitely check that out. And then if you'd like to learn more about women in the Revolutionary era, and in particular, if you were an educator who's thinking about how to teach this in your classroom, be sure to go onto the events page of our website to learn more about an upcoming professional development session that we've got going on that's featuring historian Karen Wolf. It is completely free, and she's going to be talking about all of the ways in which women are actually breaking our expectations of what are traditional and standard gender roles for women in the colonial and revolutionary eras. So be sure to check that out. I want to let everybody know that there is a survey that you all will have access to once this program closes. So please, please do fill that out. That's how we know what we've done well and what we can do better in the future. And otherwise, I just want to say thank you to our sponsors, thank you to our supporters, thank you to our members and everybody who has helped us and joined us even for this evening's program. We really appreciate you and all that you do to make sure that this institution is relevant and lives. So thank you all, and good night.